Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Andrews Memorial Theater. My name is Alan Mann. I am the Artistic Director of Opera Theater of Connecticut, and it was also my pleasure to be the staging director for this production of Giuseppe Verdi's Rigoletto, which you will be seeing later this evening. It is Verdi's 200th birthday this year. We sent him a couple of letters. He never answered back. I don't know if he's coming. But he was born in 1813, and it's also a prestigious year in opera. That's the year that The Barber of Seville first played. And when he passed away at the age of 87 in 1901, he had not only as a composer revolutionized opera, but he had also played a major role in the rebuilding of the country we now know as Italy. It's important for a lot of the story of Verdi to understand that Italy as a country that we know today doesn't exist until 1861 in the Risorgimento. There had been a pretty unified Italy, or at least they were as unified as the Italians can still be, a series of Italian city-states speaking vastly different languages. There was no language that we know of as Italian at that time. But after the Napoleonic Wars, the peninsula was chopped up into different pieces. There was a French sector, there was the Papal States, there were Austrian sectors, and they worked very hard as occupying forces to keep the Italians as disunified as possible. Verdi was born at that little part of the boot that curls up into France. So the country he was born in at that time was called Parma. And Parma has a very specific dialect. It had a specific cooking style, had very specific cheeses. Anything from Parma is referred to as Parmesan. So if you want to know where that came from, that's where it was. But it was controlled by the French, and his birth certificate actually lists his name as Joseph. His parents owned a shop that was also an inn in a very small town. And he lived there quite happily until he was about 10 years old. And his parents, when he was young, discovered that he had a lot of musical talent. So they went out of their way and they bought a small spinet piano. And that was a style of piano that had been very popular in the late 1700s into the early 1800s, but then had fallen out of style, and so they got one pretty cheap. It's a short keyboard, only 66 keys, not the 88 keys we know today, and the strings run right to left, so you could put it up against the wall, and you'd often see them in ladies' drawing rooms. Mozart makes reference to one, uses one in one of his operas. So it needed repair, and the local luthier repaired it for free. And we know that because the spinet piano still exists. It's in the Verdi Museum. And in the back it says, repaired for free by the Verdis, and he signed his name. And this is not uncommon. I come from an organ building family, the Casava family. And whenever you do a major rebuild on anything, like old pianos, or in my case, organ chests and so on, you sign it. And so I've often worked on chests signed by my great-grandfathers with their names in there. It's very interesting to follow that on. Well, he had this musical talent, and then at about age 10, his family decided that he needed a better education than he could get in his hometown. So they made arrangements with a family friend called the Barzettis down in Buzetto. It was about 10 miles away. And he was going to go and stay with them during the week. And his family, the Verdis, would pay for two different teachers, one for general education and one for music. And he would stay there during the week with them. And then on the weekend, he would walk back. Friday night, he would walk back home. And then he would stay home for the weekend and help at the shop. And then he would walk back on Monday morning and be there for his school. He hated it. He did this for 8 years, and he talks about it as a hardship. Now, not the type of hardship that Puccini had with poverty, but it was just very difficult for this young man to be going back and forth. The two teachers of his early years are very important in the foundation of his future work as a composer. His general education teacher was a royalist. This was a man who believed that you didn't question what the kings and nobles of your country did, and if they happened to be from foreign countries, that was it. You just dealt with it, and you just got on with your life. His music teacher was a nationalist, Italy for the Italians. And he grew up with two different strong influences on those two factions. And things come to a head when he's about 16, 17 years old, and it's time to matriculate to the next level. And there's a series of tests he would have to take, and his general education teacher said, I can't help you and recommend you if your music teacher is a nationalist. So you have to give up your music teacher. He goes to the music teacher, and the music teacher says, well, I understand his point. However, if you ask my opinion, stick with music. Not because you're not bright, but because you have such a fire for music. And that was what his teacher told him. So he decided he was going to stay with music. And with the help of his music teacher, he got accepted at the most prestigious music school in Italy, certainly one of the biggest ones in all of Europe, and that was the Milan Conservatory. And that's down in the Austrian sector. So at the age 18, he leaves Busseto, goes down to Milan, has his letter of acceptance, goes to the conservatory, hands it to them, and they say, oh yeah, you can't come. We de-accept you. Your music teacher is a nationalist. We hadn't noticed that, and you can't come into the school. He didn't know what to do. Now, the faculty at the conservatory is, as you imagine, quite split between royalists and nationalists. And the nationalist teachers take him on as kind of a little cause célèbre. And they teach him on the side privately, and he learns composition, counterpoint, harmonies, and all of that. He works with some very, very powerful and interesting composers and teachers, and he meets a lot of influential politicians who are very strong in the nationalist cause. And since they won, of course, it's all very important for Verdi later on. He studies, he works hard, he does very, very well, and back in Busseto there is a job opening at the big cathedral, and that is the position of organist. But organists in those days were much more than just an organ player. They played all of the churches, they were the choir masters, they were expected to compose several pieces a year, 4 or 5 pieces a year for the choir, generally there was an orchestra involved, and all of this was organized by the music society of the church. This wasn't done by the clergy. The clergy kind of kept the religious aspects of everything going, but the building and everything inside were run by all of the different lay factions. So you would have, the Flower Society, the Altar Guild, the Music Society, all these different groups that helped to take care of the inside of the church. So the Music Society listens to Verdi, and they talk about him, and there's a couple of other people involved trying to get the job, but they say, wow, he's from here, look at this, he's so talented, let's hire him. So they go to hire him, and the clergy says, you can't hire him, he's a nationalist. We won't let him play in the church. And they say, but we want him, he's really good. And they say, you can't have him. Both sides are obstinate. And the church then starts a series of services with no music. They're just Latin Mass as it used to be, and the Music Society is stymied. They don't know what to do. It starts in the fall, gets to be Christmas time, and the church does not relent. The lay society can't believe it. They're going to do Christmas Mass with no music whatsoever. So they come up with a solution. The Music Society breaks into the church, steals or takes back, based on your version of the story, all of the music that they own because they paid for it, take it out of the church, and they announce that Verdi is going to play Christmas Mass at the Franciscan church outside of town, outside of the walls. Right? Well, it's one of those era things, and like the jumping frog of Calaveras County, this hits the newspapers. This spreads all the way through France. This is what our Italian cousins are doing. They can't even organize who's going to play in a church. It is so embarrassing that King Louis Philippe has to send a royal emissary down to decide what is going to go on. So the church has someone they want to hire or have hired, and the Music Society has Verdi. So the first day, the royal emissary is there, and it's play the organ day. So Verdi comes in the afternoon. The other guys played in the morning. Verdi comes in the afternoon, and he plays the organ, and it's kind of a tie. And the next day is composed music day. So Verdi comes in the morning, and the royal emissary says, all right, here's a musical phrase. You're going to have 2 hours or so. I want you to come back with a 10-minute fugue based on this theme. Verdi comes back in 2 hours. He's got 5 full different fugues written for him. They play them all. They're absolutely wonderful. How wonderful were they? The opponent doesn't even show up in the afternoon for his aspect of it. So everybody figures, well, we're going to do it, but the church still refuses to allow him to play in their church. At this point, there is a man way back in Milan who runs the La Scala Theater, the opera, and he sees this as paid advertising. You couldn't buy this type of advertising. So he hires Verdi to be the composer for their young artists program. So Verdi, who is now married to Marguerite Barzetti, he grew up with her, marries her. They have 2 young children, and they move back down to Milan, and he starts to write this opera, Oberto, for the young artists program. Now, opera companies in those days were repertory houses. They had a stock set of singers, and they played all of the leads. They did a little rotating, but you always had the leading lady who did all of the leads of all of the major operas. And at La Scala, at that time, it was Giuseppina Strepponi. And Giuseppina may have even been involved with teaching the young artists, but she certainly was walking around in the halls during the rehearsals, and she would hear all of this music coming out. Now, Oberto is very rough in its orchestrations. Its harmonies are a little whatever, but the soprano arias are stunning. We just did a special concert to celebrate the 200th birthday of Verdi. We did the lead soprano aria from it, and it is as brilliant as anything he writes later on. Well, Giuseppina hears this all the time as she's walking around. And then, one of those great moments in opera history, a piece commissioned for the main stage doesn't show up on time. Now, this happens more than you would imagine. Many composers get their break because somebody else more famous than they were couldn't get the job done, and they had a piece ready in hand. So, Giuseppina Strepponi goes up to Morelli and he says, let's put Oberto on the main stage. And he says, well, you know, it's written for the young artist program. And she says, no, we'll put it on the main stage. Oh, come on, why? Why? I get glorious music. We're going to put it on the main stage. So it goes, he has to finish it, goes on the main stage, and while it's in rehearsals and while it's in performances, in the course of just a few months, both his daughter and then his son die. He's kind of crestfallen. He and his wife are isolated from everybody. Oberto is neither a success nor a failure. It's a very good first opera, but it's good enough that Morelli commissions from him a second opera called King for a Day. It's supposed to be a comedy. He's writing it, he gets it together, he's putting it, assembling it, and his wife gets encephalitis and she dies. Oh. The opera, as written, is not a very funny opera. They have rewritten it several times and done all sorts of things, including rewrite the entire libretto. But the original is not a very good opera, as you can imagine. Verdi takes this as a sign from above. He's going to give up his nationalist politics. He's going to go and apologize to the church at Busetto. 2 years later, the post is still vacant. So he's going to go back, and he's going to just be an organist in Busetto and live out his life. Morelli hears about this and calls Verdi to his office, and he says, I understand. I understand you need to go home, all of that. I just have one favor for you. I have a libretto here that I've asked Otto von Nicolai to write an opera for, and he says it's a terrible libretto. So I would like your opinion. I think it's good, but I respect your opinion. Can you go and read it? It's about the Jews in Babylon, controlled by Nebuchadnezzar, and I just think that it's better than Nicolai says. So he takes the libretto and he goes home and he reads it, and he comes back the next day or so, and he goes to Morelli and says, it's a wonderful libretto. I don't know what von Nicolai is thinking. It's really good. Now, at this point, there are 2 different versions of the story. There's Verdi's, and then there's Morelli's. And I'm going to tell you Morelli's because it's a much better story than Verdi's. At that moment, Morelli snaps his fingers. 2 big stagehands come out from behind the curtains. They grab Verdi, pin his arms behind his back. And he's not a small guy. They pin his arms behind his back. Morelli takes the libretto, rams it into his frock coat pocket. They drag him out, throw him into the street outside, lock the doors of the theater, and Morelli stands on the balcony yelling, write the opera! Write the opera! Well, Verdi is quite upset. He goes home. He takes the score, the libretto, throws it down on the coffee table or whatever in his living room, and starts to pack, getting ready to go home. In the course of the night, the words from one of the pieces inside the piece start to float through his head. Psalm 137. Fly thoughts on golden wings, dreaming of my homeland, so lost and so lonely, my country so beautiful but so unhappy. By the time the dawn has come around, in his mind he has composed Va Pensiero. This is, in my mind, the most important piece of opera at all, because without it, there would be no Giuseppe Verdi. There would never have been the massive change in opera and in the styles that he presented to everyone. It was such a big piece, such a powerful piece that I don't know if you've ever gone to Italy and seen opera, but I did a couple of shows down there in the 80s. The Italian crew has no respect for what goes on stage. In those days, the style was still very much when there was a set change, you would have a drop come in pretty close to the front of the stage, and you would have the soloist, the tenor, or 2 or 3 people sing a small little piece as part of the plot, and the set change would happen on behind them. Now, they did not care about it at all. You would hear, Giorgio, dammi la martello, and you'd hear the crew chief, hey, seriously, going on backstage. They were still building the set of Nabucco during the dress rehearsal. When they started to sing Va Pensiero, the crew stopped singing, everybody waited until it was over, and they gave Verdi an ovation. So everybody knew it was going to be a hit. It's performed in that season 57 performances, which is a pretty long run in a season back in those days. Va Pensiero was encored at every performance. So what? Encores were banned by the military occupiers because encores in Italian opera always had some sort of political theme. The audience refused to let the opera go on without an encore. This is 1842, and if you think they are overreacting, in 1832, a mere 10 years earlier, in the Netherlands used to be a lot larger than it was. They had what they called the Southern Netherlands, which is the country of Belgium now. 1832, in a very not good opera called La Muette di Porticini, the Mute Girl from Porticini, the tenor and baritone sing a duet called Sacred Love of the Fatherland. And it's not a very good duet either. But the audience had gone often to the show, and they all started singing along, and suddenly the crowd stood up on their feet. They left the theater. They started to call people out of their houses. They turned into a mob. They attacked the Dutch armory in town, and that started the revolution that threw the Dutch out of Belgium, and Belgium became an independent country. So they have a full reason to be very, very nervous about these encores. He starts to write work now. At this point, armed warfare breaks out. It's now a 20-year civil war between the Italians and the occupying forces. Verdi starts to write a series of operas that are incredibly political. His first one is The Lombards and the First Crusade. It's about Italian getting together, forming an Italian army. Now, in this case, they go to Jerusalem and they throw the Saracens out and they free Jerusalem. Well, you can't ban that one because, well, you know, they're freeing the Holy Land. But they censored a lot of it. There's a moment in the opera where the lead tenor goes, we will fight and we will win a homeland. And the chorus sings this major piece called Si, guerra, guerra. Yes, war, war. And the audience started to learn it and sing along in performances, like the Rocky Horror Picture Show. They would sing along. And this started to get people very nervous. He writes Macbeth, a couple of other political pieces, and then finally he writes his last great political piece called The Battle of Legno. And it's about a bunch of Italian city-states that get together, form an Italian army, and they overthrow an invading German-Austrian force that's coming into the country. Well, at this point, they all say, well, that's enough. We've given you a chance. And throughout all of Italy, Verdi's works are banned. They are not to be performed at all. About this point, Verdi, who is now living with Giuseppina Strepponi quite openly in Busetto, decides, maybe I should start writing a different style of opera. So he starts to write operas about human nature and the duality of humanity. He writes Louisa Miller, he writes Stifalio, and then neither of them are big hits. Stifalio was such a disaster, the Met tried it a few years ago with Placido Domingo, and even they couldn't complete the entire run because it's just not a very good opera. But it's his last failure. And then he writes Rigoletto, Traviata, and Trovatore in a 2-year sequence. Now, Le Roi s'amuse is the play by Victor Hugo that the Rigoletto is based on. It is about Francois I. It was written just a few years before it became an opera. And Francois I was 300 years earlier. And so even though it was about a long time ago, it's a thinly veiled slam at the court of King Louis Philippe. It played one performance, it got through the censors, played one performance, and then it was banned. It was 30 years before it was ever done in France again. For some reason, Piave and Verdi thought, hey, this would make a really great opera. And so he took it and he wrote the opera. The original, the working title is The Curse. So they write the libretto, and the libretto is handed to the censors because everything had to go through censors in those days. And the censors read it and they call them in and they say, okay, there are 5 problems with this opera. The title, The Curse. You can't call it The Curse because the curse is put on by a normal human being, not by someone in the priesthood, and that the curse would have any effect is very Protestant. So you can't do that. The second one is, it's a king. You can't have somebody try to kill a king no matter how bad the king is. The third one, there's a great scene in the play where Gilda Blanche has locked herself in the room, and he's outside the king with the courtiers, and they say, how are you going to get in? And he reaches into the pocket of his dressing coat, and he pulls out a second key, and he holds it up in front of the courtiers as the curtain closes on Act 3. Well, this was way too salacious. You couldn't put that on a stage in Italy, good God. Her suicide, spoiler alert, she dies at the end. Her suicide was she commits suicide. This is a sin. You can't have somebody commit suicide. And finally, a hunchback. Really? You're going to have a hunchback in your opera? That's absolutely insane. So they retitle it Rigoletto. So it's not The Curse. They change it from the King of France to the Duke of Mantua. Now, since this is in the south and Duke of Mantua is in the north, okay, you can kill the Duke of Mantua. We don't care. He takes out the key scene. They rewrite a bunch of what Gilda sings, and you'll see it in the super titles. She's very much like Christ. Oh, I forgive the 2 villains who do this, may the person I'm doing this for the man I love. And it's all very sacrificial. So her suicide is not just suicide, it's more sacrificial. And they keep the hunchback. You're going to write an opera about a hunchback? Go ahead. No, but nobody's going to go. And pleased to see that political censorship is still as accurate then as it was now. So Rigoletto comes out, and it is a huge hit, instantly, a major, major success. He's starting to write the opera Trovatore, and he gets a letter from Giuseppina Strepponi. I'm leaving Buzetto, I'm going back to France. They had met in Paris. It's fine for you, you're traveling all over the world, but I'm left here alone. Let me tell you what it's like for me here. I walk down the street, people cross the street because they don't want to talk to me. I go to church on Sunday, I sit in our pew, and if the people in the next pew are there, they get up and they walk away. I can't go into a shop and buy anything because no one will serve me. Verdi he flips out. He's not a man with a small ego, and in his mind, he is the best thing that has ever happened to Buzetto. He writes a letter to his father-in-law, his former father-in-law, and he puts the play aside, and he takes the play written by a friend of theirs in Paris, Alexandre Dumas the son, about Marie Duplessis, who was a woman of generous favors who actually had heart and soul, who dies, and he writes the opera Violetta. And he sends the libretto to Giuseppina. And Giuseppina reads it, and she makes one change to the libretto. She changes the title from Violetta to La Traviata. Now, that doesn't seem like much for us now. But 20 years earlier, Donizetti had written an opera specifically for Giuseppina Strepponi about the same type of character. And in opera, for the first time ever, the term La Traviata is used in reference to her character. Everyone who saw that opera, Traviata, when it opened in 54, knew exactly who the opera was about. There was no doubt about it. She had put her stamp on that will last throughout history. He then, and just by the way, it was a failure because the note says the time is the present. They wouldn't let them do it in the present. They had to set it back 300 years. So imagine Traviata set with the high white wigs, the long, big hoop skirts, men in silk pants with tights. It lost something. A year later, it was done by a small company that didn't care about government censors, and it was a huge hit. Traviata, followed by Trovatore. He writes a series of other operas, becomes world famous, and he writes the opera Don Carlos in France. It gets translated into Italian for Don Carlo. Huge hit, and he retires. 16 years later, he is offered the largest commission ever offered to a composer in history by the Grand Vizier of Egypt to write an opera set in Egypt because they're hoping to time it for the opening of the Suez Canal. Doesn't quite work, but he writes the opera Aida. While he's writing Aida, by the way, there's a 3-week break in rehearsals, so he writes the Verdi Requiem. Now, if you think about it, the Verdi Requiem was written for the voices of the people singing in Aida. So Aida was the soprano, the Ramades is the tenor, the priestess is the mezzo, and the father is the bass. Think about those voices compared to many of the voices we hear singing Aida now. Very, very different. Aida comes out, it's a big hit, very rich. He retires. 16 years later, he gets a letter from Arrigo Boito. Arrigo Boito was the first poet laureate of Italy, and he was very busy writing poetry and novels in what is now the new Italian language. He took little bits from all of the dialects, combined them together, and was trying to unify the country with one language. And he says, I have a great libretto of the opera Othello. I think you should write it. I'm in retirement. Oh, come on, take a read it. Just let me think. So he sends him the libretto. He loves it. He writes Othello. It's a big hit. Verdi retires. 6 years later, he gets a letter from Boito. I think you should try another comedy. I have taken the opera, I've written an opera called Falstaff, and I would like you to do the score. He says, okay, sure. He writes Falstaff. Falstaff, huge international hit, almost instantly. It's wonderful. Verdi retires. 6 years later, he gets a letter from Boito saying, I have a project I want to talk to you. Can you come down to Milan? He comes down to Milan. He's staying at the Grand Hotel, and while he's there, 1901, he has a stroke. Everyone in Milan who considers him, of course, a Milanese, they gather around the hotel. Thousands of people, 24-hour vigil. They block downtown. There's no traffic. You can't get in or out. Thousands of people. And builds and builds. And finally, after a week, the manager of the hotel steps out on his balcony and says, the maestro has left us. Dead silence. One voice, they say, starts, then joined by another, then hundreds, then 1,000 people all start to sing Va Pensiero, the song that made him a composer, unified the country. And with that, that was the end of Verdi. Some of the great stories about him, Milan Conservatory, for example. Later in his life, they send him this apparently very long letter. Oh, Maestro Verdi, you are the greatest Italian composer ever. You have done so much for Italy. You are this, you are that, blah, blah. It would be a great honor if we could change the name of the Milan Conservatory after you. You know, the Verdi Conservatory would live forever, and your name would live forever. Long pages. He sends back a telegram, 2 lines. Wouldn't have me when I was young. Can't have me now that I'm old. I'm going to tell you one more story about this opera before you go. It was done in Venice. It was written for the La Fenice Theater, which means the Phoenix Theater. Lots of theaters in Italy or throughout Europe, and lots of inns and so on are always called the Phoenix. And what are Phoenixes famous for? Rising from their ashes. You have big wooden buildings lit by gas lights, lit by candles. What are they going to do like every 5 years? They're going to burn down, and you're going to have to build them again. That's why theaters are called the Phoenix. This one was in Venice on the canal, and the gondoliers used to make a point of driving by the opera house when they were in rehearsals so they could hear the songs that were being sung, learn them, and then sing them as they were going down along in the canals before the opera was open. Verdi hated this. La Donna Mobile, one of the great pieces, you'll hear it in the 4th act. He didn't give the music to the orchestra or the tenor until 2 days before the opera opened. He had 2 days to learn it, integrate it, and put it in. And when you hear the final act, it's in and out and in and out. But that was his way of getting around how everybody was going to learn the music ahead of time. So it really was a debut for him. I think you're going to enjoy our performance. We have worked very, very hard. We have a wonderful cast. We have, done a pretty traditional rendition of it. We've gone through the libretto carefully and worked on character analysis and so on. So it's going to be a great show. It starts at 6 o'clock. If you are here and you have dinners, they're going to be served outside on beautiful lawn outside out that way. If you have time, otherwise, down below us is the art gallery, the art show from the Clinton Art Society. The town museum room is open down around the corner and to the right. And with that, thank you all very, very much for being here. I look forward to seeing you.